Geographers. We're going to talk some industry, some industrial geographies, some economic geographies, and this will lead into the development stuff. I think that's what I'm talking about next time, and globalization and urban stuff. This is some pretty important stuff, even though it can be mind-numbing as well. And the whole thing with, this is called industry, this lecture topic, but we're looking at economics, right? How people make a living effectively in the world and how it is geographic. And this is going to be like everything we talk about in this, lower division intro class. It's going to be broad, and I'm not going to cover everything here today in terms of economic geographies, but we'll hit on some stuff. And just to kind of set the stage for what we get into later, just keep in mind that economics is it's awful to study and to read about and all of that, to try to pay attention to. But you got to do it because it is so important in terms of understanding how the world works. And that, no offense, econ majors, if you're out there. And honestly, what you're going to see, I'll rail against the whole idea of economics, but at the same time, it's also me saying, like, oh, you fool, you should have majored in it, because that's how you take over the world, as we'll get into. And the great thing about studying economics, too, and what we'll learn is it's all witchcraft and magic. And we'll see examples of that today, and we'll especially see it when we get into why we have poor countries and wealthy countries and how globalization works and all sorts of stuff like that. We're kind of starting to see that now with the response to COVID-19 and economic policies in this country and the other. So it's really important, but it's also silly, and we'll get through it together. Now, one key thing is to realize that you cannot have economics without politics. These things are linked, and that's something that where people will try to make economics seem like this pure scientific thing, and it's all about the numbers, and we'll look at charts and all of that. But no, this stuff is, well, it's quite often presented as being scientific, and there's this methodical way of going about and gathering data and analyzing it and presenting information, and we can classify it as a science in the way in which it's done, but it's also a very political thing, and human emotion and bias and all that gets into it as well, whether we want to admit it or not. And it seems like these days more people are admitting it, but still kind of committed to their idea is the best idea. And I have two things I just found online that kind of show not only is it a political concept, but you can effectively have two completely opposite attitudes towards how economies should run and how industry should be run and stuff like that, and still come to the same conclusions. On the left here, we have Milton Friedman, who is Mr. Capitalism, in terms of like modern neoliberal capitalism. And I'm going to get into, we're not going to do it today. Although as I'm rambling here, I'm realizing maybe I should change some stuff around and start talking about neoliberalism earlier as I get into this stuff. We'll get into what that actually means, because that's an important term. But he is really an architect of like how our country approaches global economies. All right, and so Friedman here, this quote attributed to him, saying that history suggests that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. Clearly, it is not a sufficient condition. So what is this quote saying? It's saying that, look, if you want to have some kind of political freedom, if you want to have a true democracy in your nation, you gotta be capitalist. It's not the only thing. You're gonna need some other stuff, but you can't be free and not be a capitalist. All right, and that sounds very American. And then we go over to the right here. We have this troublemaker, Karl Marx, Mr. Communism. Right, so two totally separate groups here. And Marx is saying democracy is the road to socialism. So really saying that yeah, once you're truly democratic in that true sense that people have a say, you can't help but be a socialist nation because it's the most fair and just way of doing things. Now these two images, I just pulled these from like a Google Images search. I these actual quotes I haven't found in either of the writings. So I did some fact checking, which is always important because honestly, anybody can put whatever. In fact, I saw one guy online was putting it was images of Ronald Reagan and quotes from somebody who definitely wasn't right. I think it was like Stalin or Mao or something like that, which is just, I mean, it's a fun exercise. And the guy was posting it online to sow confusion, which I always respect. So, that said, when you get stuff like that, do a little fact checking before you put this up on your wall or your social media account or whatever it is you have. So, looking at, what freedom is saying, I mean, this is effectively what that little image was saying. Friedman here writing, historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. And really if we look at historical examples, the argument would be that, like, here in the United States, we've got this political freedom. We also have this concept of a free market, that, capitalism, the market decides what, goes on. Things that make economic sense will become the policy, not what some authoritarian says. And then typically this is contrasted with, the Soviet Union, where you have, classic examples of authoritarian governments telling you what to do. You have no freedom, and that's they're also socialist, right? So that's the idea that's right here, and this is very debatable because, well, we'll see some stuff like even just that idea of a free market, as well as political freedom. It's a fuzzy thing. We'll see some of that today and in future lectures. With Marx, something as simple as democracy is the road to socialism or whatever. I don't know about that. But in the manifesto of the Communist Party, he and Engels wrote, the proletarians, meaning the working class, working people, the people who aren't the elite, the bourgeois, proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. Right? And so it's the idea where he's saying that really you can't be free in the sense that you can control your own destiny, to have real agency, to actually do what you want, until you get rid of this concept of private property, of people owning things that you then have to, work for, people owning the factory that you then go and get a job for, to be truly free, to be masters of the productive forces of society, right? To really have a say in what's going on. He and Engels here are arguing that this stuff has to not be owned by a small group, but to be owned by the whole of society. Right? So the idea kind of saying different things here, but it's still flirting with the same idea of freedom. So Milton Friedman, again, saying, like, you want to be free, let the market decide. Let capitalism do its thing, and that'll keep, authoritarians out of control. Marx, along with Engels here, they're saying that, like, you want to be free, you got to get rid of those capitalists who are actually the authoritarians who are in control. All right, does that make sense? Hopefully that's a little clearer, more simple here. But the general concept is that all this stuff, it's political. It's not just about spending money and things like supply and demand, which seem very just kind of sterile and scientific. This is quite the political battle for a lot of people. So that's what we're going to be getting into over the next few lectures here. Another thing that's worth discussing, and I do this, I don't talk about like the neoliberalism, the capitalism in the same way that I'll discuss later, and that's primarily because we in this country we learn about economics in the sense of a capitalist, in quotes, free market society that we have. And then we also learn that communism, it's a bad thing, and we just don't talk anymore about it. I think it's worth discussing the concept. And this is also, I realize I run the risk of being one of those, Marxist professors who brings up Karl Marx and is trying to indoctrinate his students, which I always find so cute when people say that. The reason why professors discuss Marx is because he was a brilliant individual in the sense that he studied capitalism, honestly, like better than anybody else in the 19th century, because he was treating it like this, like a true scientific problem. That it was, and I say problem in the sense of it's a question out there. It's this thing. It's this unknown. The market is taking off. The Industrial Revolution has come to fruition. Economies have changed throughout Europe, and so Marx is like, he's saying, what's going on here? How does this stuff work? And that's what his big major work, Capital, is all about. Right? Is studying the stuff, seeing how it works, and in studying it, he came to the conclusion that it was bad, and he wanted some other system in place. Right? That's the idea. So what Marx is writing about, like so we already saw, this idea of production, and quite often we hear about the means of production when people are talking about Marxism and his work and all of that. Means of production refers to the stuff required to be able to make things and sell things and all of that. So, and in Marx's time, a very different time from what we have right now, but we have stuff like factories. These big manufacturing factories are coming into being. We have textile mills and steel mills and stuff like that. You have a small group of wealthy Europeans who own the means of production, but the wealth, kind of like Marx is arguing, is that it's the poor that are actually producing that wealth, right? It's being produced by the poor working class, the proletariat. They're the ones who are actually doing the hard work, right? And so his argument is saying, this is a very unfair system, that you had people who are already wealthy and doing well to begin with. They're able to seize the means of production through a variety of ways, and we don't have time to get into the whole Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution and land use policy in places like Britain early on as this is starting out. But it's the idea that you have this elite group that holds the property, that owns this stuff, and then they're able to hire the poor to come in and be wage labor. And through his study of this, Marx is showing how really when you go in, you're producing this surplus labor. You've got this productivity where you're getting paid so much, but you're actually producing more in that sense, right? And we think about it, that's how capitalism works. But his argument is like, that's really unfair for the poor, right? That's the idea that the wealthy really don't have anything that they have to do. The wealth is being produced by the poor. It's an unfair system. It ought to change. That's what he's saying. And it's one of those things, like in this country, a lot of people get angry about that nonsense and communism, we freak out. But then you ask them and you're like, well, does your boss work harder than you? And quite often we all say no, right? I've worked in plenty of jobs. I'm not going to talk about my current job because I want to keep it. But previous job, like jobs that were outside of academia, when I worked just in, what we call normal jobs, grown up jobs, stuff like that. Even, like retail part time stuff I did while I was going through school. No, I never felt that my boss was working harder, yet the boss made more money, right? That's the kind of idea here. And so what Marx and Engels and people who, became communists, what they're arguing is that the workers should actually take over. We'd have some kind of revolution, and Marx was envisioning it would be this global thing to where you would, have the workers take over, seize the means of production. The same stuff is going to be produced. We continue to manufacture steel and clothing and produce food and all of that. But this wealthy elite, they're removed, and therefore everybody's living in a much better way because that wealth gets distributed. All right? And the idea, the goal of true communism is you get to this point where there is no longer a government. All right? There's no longer money, there's no longer class difference, anything like that. It's the idea is that everyone is truly equal, free, and you're working for the good of society. All right, and that's in that cute. That's where it gets into trouble. That's why my own thoughts are you could never have a truly communist society if that society is greater than three people. Uh, really, because just people ruin it, right? The idea of working for the good of society, we don't really see that ever. So it's a nice idea, this utopian idea of everyone, doing their thing for the good of everyone else, but it's questionable. And really, we've never seen, despite saying that certain, countries are communist, either, present day or in the past, we've never seen true communism existing. All right, what we've actually seen is what's been called socialism, which is this transition period. Right? When we're going between a capitalist society toward that communist ideal, that utopia. Right? So, like the Soviet Union, it's a great example. We always call them communists, but they weren't truly communist because they had a central government, a quite authoritarian central government. Um, but the thought was that you needed to use government as this intermediary between that capitalist society and the wealthy elites holding on to stuff, and then getting to that full transfer of the means of production to the people, to the proletariat. And it doesn't always work out so well. Again, the thing is that people get in the way, and it's a political thing, and power is involved. So that's why we've seen issues with a lot of this stuff, whether it is in the former Soviet Union, whether we're talking about modern day Venezuela or Cuba or China. It's fuzzy, right? So to simply say communist is a fuzzy thing. To even say socialist or socialism, that's a fuzzy term, just like capitalism, honestly is. There are different shades of capitalism, different ways in which capitalism has been implemented and regulated and all of that. It's the same thing with socialism. And it drives me crazy. This is one of my pet peeves. That's why I'm ranting about this stuff. Is that it just drives me crazy when people throw out these terms and they don't fully grasp the nuance behind them. And that's on the one hand, it's people who, look at any Democrat. It's always on the Democrat side. And you call, they're socialists or communists or whatever. And we say that as like, and therefore they're the devil. Not understanding what that means. And you see people talking all the time, examples of this, where really to say socialism or communism, it simply means anything I disagree with. I don't trust, right? Like gays or commies or, whatever, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's one thing that drives me crazy. But even that, like that full on ignorance, I can respect that a little bit because you're fully ignorant. So go for it. But then what also drives me crazy are the people on the other side who should know better but make a big deal. Like when Bernie Sanders was running for president this go round, there were a lot of people who, once he started gaining momentum, people in like the New York Times are writing things about like, he's not a real socialist. Why is he saying he's a socialist? And they're saying like he doesn't actually want to have this Soviet style, seizing of the means of production, seizing of private property, and all that. But that isn't synonymous, right? To be socialist and to be Soviet, those are separate contextual things, right? And so what a guy like Bernie Sanders is saying, and a lot of other people on the left are arguing for, is not, well, there are some who argue for that Soviet style stuff, but it's not going for this fully, um, public government owned system, but instead just, using government to help regulate this balance between the upper elite class, the people who own everything, and the working class who really own nothing, regardless of whether you own your home or have a car that you own outright or whatever. It's different. It's the idea of kind of regulating that balance, right? That's what most Democrats who are advocating this concept of democratic socialism, they're just saying use government to help balance stuff out. A very different concept from what we saw with a guy like Stalin, but still it's going toward that idea of not letting free market capitalism just do its thing. Hopefully this all makes a little sense. I'll rant more about this stuff as we go on, but here's a little basic introduction if you haven't heard this stuff before about what communism truly is, socialism truly is. We'll continue to see examples of both of these things, but we'll go back to this idea of free market capitalism, which that's a myth. Kind of like the same way in which true communism is this myth, it's this ideal, it's something that always exists in the future that we might strive toward if we're communists, but nobody's ever made it there. It's the same thing with free market capitalism. Right? And it's the idea, when we say free market capitalism, it means no regulations whatsoever in terms of, labor issues, monopoly issues, any of that stuff, laws that are in place. So that could be, things like a minimum wage. That goes against the idea of a free market, right? Or, weekends off or paid sick leave, things like that. That's not free market. Right? Monopoly laws, not allowing one massive corporation to take over and own everything within their industry. Those laws are not free market, because the whole idea with the free market is no, let people do whatever they want with, their wealth and their property and all that. And if they can get somebody to work for them for $1 an hour, great. That's what the market has decided is, a fair wage for this specific job. And honestly, if it isn't a fair wage, well, then people stop working for that company, and they, then therefore that business will fail if they don't start paying people more money, right? So it's just the idea, it's pure money, capital flow that is going to determine what life is like in an area, right? That's the idea. It's a myth. Well, it's not really. It did work in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. When we had infant mortality rates skyrocketing, stuff like that. So we've seen it early on, and it freaked everybody out because it was so cruel and so evil that pretty much everybody decided, yeah, let's regulate this a little bit. Let's ease up. Like, capitalism seems pretty cool, but we got to get some oversight in here. We got to get some regulation in place. So a lot of people talk about the free market. We haven't seen it for, centuries, or at least, a century at this point in time. Okay, so free market is another one of those myths that people speak of. And honestly, governments play a huge role to try to ensure that capitalism continues forward. So it's the idea, like, if you're pro-capitalism, you should actually be anti-free market, in the sense that state agencies, different governments, and sub-agencies within governments and all that are working to ensure that capitalism moves forward, that you don't have some economic collapse that's going to lead to some massive revolution that could lead to, some socialist state or whatever. That's what governments are doing, or like our government is doing. We try to bring more investment home. We'll talk about that in a little bit, like attracting foreign investors. We also try to make sure that we diversify our national economies so we don't let people just kind of do whatever they want, or at least we encourage, people to start getting jobs in this particular sector, or kind of do less jobs here, more jobs over here. Because if we have a diverse economy, we can be much stronger. Because if we have one crisis over here in in market X, this other one will be okay, and our whole economy won't collapse. Okay? Oil is a great example of this, where quite often, I mean, it's been the case for a while now, where being in the oil industry has been a good, lucrative thing. You're kind of guaranteed to make a ridiculous amount of money, right? But then every now and then we have these little crises that take place. This was back, I want to say this was in 2015 when this was happening here. But we had a drop in oil price. Oh, yeah, there's in the image there, 2015. We had a drop in oil prices. Venezuela, which is a technically, socialist state, and they're a mess and falling apart, and maybe you've read about that, maybe not. Go ahead and Google them for a little bit. It's been rough for these guys, but they're big. Like the way in which they have made money is through oil, exporting oil, selling oil to other countries, and it's been great for a while. But then you have this crash, and it's just a disaster because that's pretty much all they were doing. Right? And it's easy to point to those commies and say, haha, the fools, communism will never work. Same thing was happening in Kern County at the exact same time, where Kern County, Bakersfield and the surrounding area, their big deal is oil as well. I mean, there's agriculture and all of that, but really it's oil is where the money is. It's driven just the development of Kern County quite a bit, and so everything's going great until oil prices plummet, and then suddenly nobody's got any money, right? Not just the corporations, but local governments who are taxing the companies that are making money off of the oil. The taxes aren't coming in, and therefore the government's in crisis, schools, fire department, that kind of stuff, right? So same idea. The good news, though, for Kern County is that the rest of California, as well as the country, has other industries that are going on. So if these guys suffer, we can get emergency funds and bail them out for a little bit until oil comes back and, they can repay loans or whatever. But if your country only has this one industry, you're out of luck internally, and you've got to rely on other countries for help. And we'll talk about this. It gets into the role of the World Bank. This gets into development in general. A country like Venezuela needs some help. Most people who are going to come in to be able to help, either global entities or big, powerful, wealthy countries, they're going to say, look, we'd love to help you, but let's get rid of this whole communism thing, right? They start to change. They start to demand that you change in a certain way to be able to get some money to be able to. It's a way in which we'll, again, get into this. I don't want to go too much into this because we'll be talking about it in a week or so. But it's the idea that if a country is taking out some big loan, that it's just like, what a bank will do. They say, okay, we'll loan you this money, but we want to make sure that you can pay it back. Right? And quite often at the country level, it's stuff like, all right, if you're going to be able to pay it back, it means this government system you have in place, that's what got you into trouble in the first place, so no more. And these things, what you're spending money on over here, get rid of it, spend money on this. And then we'll loan you the money, because then we're sure that you'll be able to pay it back. And that might sound reasonable. we'll get into how that hasn't worked out so well for a lot of countries. So we'll discuss that. And back to the oil thing. This 2015, God, that's cute. Because in 2020, which you may or may not be aware of, oil actually got to the point where it was trading at negative values. So a barrel of oil, which is the unit in which it's traded or sold, right? Like a bunch of grapes or a bushel of apples or whatever, right? It's a barrel of oil, and it went down to around like negative $40 a barrel. And it was a case where it was just too much was being produced. The whole COVID-19 thing, globally, for the most part, people are at home. Nobody's driving. Nobody's flying. Even planes are still going, but it's like two people on each plane. If you see the images online, so nobody's using oil as they normally would. So the supply is just building up, and it got to the point where like we're running out of places to store oil. And so people were actually paying others like, I'll give you $40 a barrel if you just take this off of my hands, which is a good deal. I mean, I'm tempted to buy a few barrels. I don't know how storing it works. Why not? I'll buy them for negative $40 and store it in my backyard and then turn it for a profit, right? Sounds reasonable. I don't think it works that way. But still, you can see how volatile this stuff is and how kind of silly it can be, but it's linked to other stuff, right? It's not simply just numbers on a chart or dollars and this commodity and this and that. Everything's connected, and we'll see more and more of that. And that's why having some kind of government intervention, whether you believe in government or not, that's why it is so important with the way in which the system currently exists, right? And should that system exist in this way, we'll talk about that later. But that's the idea. With the present system we have, free market is actually it's a very dangerous thing for average people. And another term I've already discussed this, but capital. That term we use it quite a bit. It's important to understand exactly what it is as we discuss this stuff. Capital is referring to wealth, and that can be actual dollars, money that you have, or it can be stuff. All right, like a factory. It's a great example of that. If you own a factory, that's something you own. It's a thing, but it also can be used to advance production, right? It can be used to make stuff. Right? And this doesn't just have to be manufacturing. I mean, that's the easiest way to think about it. But we'll see. We'll get into different sectors of industry, and we'll see it's not just about making cars or clothes or TVs or whatever. Like advancing production means just to continue this process of the flow of capital. So it's money or stuff used to make more money, right? Which then you can, if you take that money you make, those profits, and you use it to invest in other stuff to continue with production, you put it back into your business, say, that money is capital, right? As opposed to just sheer profits, wealth that we hold on to. And so capital, we say it in this context, is referring to some kind of wealth that we're investing, that we're using to make more money. And so business owners do this, right? You take money that you're making and you use it to hire more people, so you can make more stuff and in theory more money, or you use it to invest in computers or robots or like whatever it might be. So that's what capital is, and governments are involved in this. They will supply capital in some way to try to ensure that business continues, right? The production continues. So again, it's not a case of wealthy investors. We hear, venture capitalists. You probably heard that term. The idea of just already wealthy people are like, I got $50,000. I want to invest it in the next big thing. The idea that you're going to make more money, right? It's not just private entities that just happen to have wealth. Government is directly involved with this concept, right? This is a recent example. I don't know if you guys remember this. 2019 seems like like so long ago. But Amazon, well, have you heard of Amazon? It's a company. Amazon was starting to look like they're headquartered in, I think it's Seattle, right? It's the Pacific Northwest. I'm pretty sure it's Seattle. They were looking for a second headquarters, which second headquarters sounds lame. HQ2. That sounds sexy. That's a very tech guy concept here. But Amazon was looking for, where are we going to put our second headquarters because we're such a big entity. And it was this huge circus. The idea that the cities all over the country were fighting to get the rights for this stuff, and like some little communities were like, "We'll change your name to Amazon." That's something that cities do quite often, and it's super embarrassing. But they do it. We'll call ourselves Amazon Kentucky, or I forget where exactly it was. I think a few places were willing to do this, and every state had a company or a city willing to do this. And honestly, the way in which you were going to get Amazon to come to your location was really, what were you going to give Amazon, right? What capital were you going to give in terms of free land and not making them pay taxes and stuff like that, right? So Amazon, like the wealthiest company in the world, I assume. Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest guy in the world. I think. I don't pay attention to how these guys are ranked, but he's doing okay, is what I understand. But yeah, so they already have all this money that could be used for capital, but other cities are desperately trying to, throw capital at Amazon to say like, look, we'll give you so much and you can be here. And they picked. They actually split it. It was an area in Queens, in New York, and an area just outside of Washington, D.C. So in Virginia, these two places were going to be the HQ2 site. And then you saw, like, right after that decision, like, you see this one Fort Worth article about, like, what happened, right? Why didn't Fort Worth get it? And this guy, I forget exactly what was in the article, but it was one of those things where it was like, well, needed a little more diversity here and this here and this here. It's like, no, you lost out because you didn't have any money to be able to throw a bunch of stuff at Amazon, right? If you were smaller than Washington, D.C. or New York, it wasn't going to happen, right? So that's what happened right there. And it was ridiculous how much was offered. And it got to the point where people, when this happened and people did the research and figured stuff out, people in New York were very mad about Amazon coming in and what New York City was willing to do. And so you got to the point where Amazon pulled out of New York and have just focused on DC itself and Crystal City to, I think it's still moving forward there. I haven't since looked into it. But it was the idea that with all the subsidies, so again, the idea that New York is going to give Amazon a lot of stuff, it came down to, the job, because that's always the thing. It's like, yeah, but think of the jobs. It's going to make, 20,000 jobs or whatever. But those jobs were going to cost New York taxpayers about $50,000 for each job, right? So if you think about that, like, it would almost make more sense to just have like a lottery system in place, keep Amazon out of there, right? And just, give, 20,000 people $50,000 just like that. I mean, that sounds great. And the idea, the reason why we don't do that is because it's you're hoping that this is an investment, right? The cities or the states are using their capital to try to increase production and therefore make, wealth back in terms of taxes and spending and all of that. But really, with a lot of this, it's very questionable in terms of whether or not it works. And it's not, I mean, Amazon's the big example, but we've seen it, like, it's here in the Antelope Valley. You guys familiar with BYD? It's a company here. Did anybody know what I'm talking about? What does BYD stand for? Build your dreams, which I love. And so it's a Chinese company, and they manufacture electric buses. Right? And they've been here for a while now. But Lancaster was able to attract BYD to get this company to come here to Lancaster to build a plant where they would manufacture these buses. And and it sounds great, right? Getting jobs coming here. That's a relevant thing. I've known students who have been connected with the company in some way. It's always, man, I don't know what it is about China. It's always, whenever a student mentions it, it's always like a non-Chinese student who is discussing it, like, yeah, my mom works there or whatever, and it's always, oh, it's a little racisty, but it's a job, so we'll put up with the weird Chinese. That's kind of the attitude. But the reason why they're here in Lancaster and not elsewhere is because the city of Lancaster paid a lot of money, invested their capital to try to bring the company. So, like this article from the Antelope Valley Press saying that the city itself of Lancaster paid $1.5 million for the land that BYD was, this wealthy company, a company that's doing okay if they're looking to expand overseas. The city's saying, "Oh yeah, we'll give you this quite lucrative money." And it's not like the city council is saying like, "Well, we'll put some stuff together, we'll set up a GoFundMe or whatever to pay this money." No, this is tax dollars, right? This is people who live in Lancaster, shop in Lancaster. These are tax dollars that are going to this Chinese company to get them to stay here and to build stuff. And it's great if you paid attention to, like, I sort of paid attention when this was coming in. It was fantastic. Like when they started actually doing work here, they got into a little trouble, the company itself, because they were paying like Chinese wages to people, which is effectively like slave labor wages here. And they claimed like, oh, whoops, that was the little accounting error. So that's silly. But at the same time, they're making electric buses, right? So that's a good, green thing. So it gets fuzzy. And there are people here who have jobs that they wouldn't necessarily have jobs for. And the real thing to do is to find out, to do the investigation to see how much money the city of Lancaster, as well as maybe the state of California, have given to this company. And then in turn, how much has come back. And frankly, there are a lot of examples of things that, I don't know about this specifically, but things like Walmarts and shopping malls and stuff like that, where they're given so much initially and even into perpetuity that we don't necessarily ever see a profit, but it makes, politicians look good and it makes the company look good and all that. But it's God, what it almost sounds like is socialism. Right? And that's what we start to realize is that for all the fear of socialism and distributing wealth and all that, and actually, when you look at it, it's been going on quite a bit. It's not going to the people that true proponents of socialism often want it to go to, right? It's going back to that wealthy capitalist class, right? But this is happening. And we could also point to this and say, like, me, I live in Palmdale. So I look at this and I go, haha, Lancaster, what a corrupt armpit. I'm so glad I don't live there. Palmdale did the same thing. And this is the great, like, little brother relationship that Palmdale and Lancaster have. So Lancaster, they get them a Chinese bus company. Palmdale says, oh, yeah, we'll show you. And we get a Japanese train car company. Swear to God. It's so absurd. Like, we want an Asian company too that builds stuff that people go in. Yeah, and I don't know exactly how much Palmdale paid to get this stuff. We did, let's just say our last mayor got voted out because of corruption. Read into that what you will. This stuff happens all the time. All right, so we need to just be aware of that, and it's worth thinking about as a taxpayer, which you are kind of by default. Some pay more than others and all that, but just think about that we're giving this money to the government, but then it's being used in a way, and it also kind of questions this idea of true democracy and freedom. How much of that is there? Right? Just something to think about. Now, another thing that governments do in order to help with capital and have anything but a free market. One concept that's been kind of popular to discuss recently is that of tariffs. Right? And a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So something coming from a foreign country that we import into this country, we put a tax on them, and it's the idea the tax is high enough to make that imported good cost more than the domestic good. Right? So it's the idea if you're at the store and you're faced with like three options and you've got the cheapest one, it's the one you're going to go for. If if everything else is equal, you go for the one that costs less. And so if we artificially manufacture it, so the cheapest one is the local one, that's going to help our economy at the expense of other foreign economies, and it's seen as a way to help build up, our own economy. The story that's been told, like I learned this in high school, I remember, was the success that Ronald Reagan had using tariffs. This is when I first learned about what these things were, and it was all about how like Reagan was this genius. About what he did was he put tariffs on Japanese motorcycles, and we had so Harley Davidson. You say that word today, that's a brand that like people respect, and it's just, oh yeah, I'm willing to pay 50 grand on a motorcycle if it's a Harley because that's a quality bike. But really, Harleys were awful back in the late 70s and 80s, and that they were expensive but not as reliable as they could be. I mean, they were still cool. They had that image, that attitude, but they were way more expensive and way less reliable than the Hondas and Yamahas and things that were coming in to the country. And so Harley Davidson is suffering as a result because people are like, yeah, I'll buy the Japanese bike that actually starts when I try to turn it on, and it costs less and all that. So people start spending more on Japanese bikes. Harley is suffering, so Reagan steps in and he imposes a tax, a tariff on Japanese bikes. Right? So American motorcycles like Harley, they're the same price they have been. What was a cheaper motorcycle like a Honda that's coming in, that tax goes onto it, so now it costs more than the Harley. So yeah, while it might be a little more dependable and all that, it costs more and it's not as cool, right? Because it's a Japanese bike. So I'm gonna go ahead and buy the Harley. So it was a way to artificially increase sales, not because of a free market. Or when I say artificial, meaning it's not free market capitalism, which is what we always love to tout, but it was the government itself coming in, using these tariffs to help the American company. Right? And it was a case where, the taxes, they didn't like go to, Japan was kind of, just had to deal with it. And we can have counter tariffs where Japan could impose others and stuff like that. I mean, that's how it works. But really for consumers, it just looks like, yeah, okay, the Harley's cheaper, I'm going to buy that. Right? And so then Harley starts making more money. They invest that money, it's capital, right? They invest it into building better bikes and making the product that's there today. Tariffs saved America. And then more recently, Trump brought in this concept of tariffs. I kind of suspect that it's that idea that, people just, we've told ourselves this concept of, Reagan used tariffs to save Harley Davidson. It just sounds cool. Hasn't worked quite the same way. We've had these trade wars that have been happening, and it hasn't been that neat thing like where American steel is suddenly a powerhouse in the world and all that. It's been messy, right? And we see if you actually study the stuff and you go back, that's usually what happens. Tariffs, quite often, as far as I can tell, they harm industries in a way much more often than they help them. Right? The U.S. cotton industry back in the 70s was a great example. Asian cotton is a lot cheaper. So people are importing it rather than relying on U.S. cotton farmers. So we impose a tariff. And so, yeah, now cotton is cheaper here. Asian producers, they can't sell their cotton over here. So what do? They switch to synthetic materials, polyester, nylon, that kind of stuff. And they take off there and are able to, produce textiles and all that in a cheaper way with non-cotton stuff. And they leave our textile industry behind. Right? We're so focused on cotton, we don't do the research on the synthetic stuff, and so Asia actually profits in the long term, and our economy suffers. Right? So it's a very tricky thing to have governments come in and mess with stuff, and that's sometimes why people push for this free market idea. But honestly, as I said, we haven't seen free market stuff for a long time, and there's a reason for that, because to have that totally free market, it can be a lot worse than just, having some oopsies in some different economic sectors. All right, now, and in fact, I don't know, look, we haven't always made stuff the way in which we made stuff. We haven't always had economies run the way in which we have economies run. We had these cottage industries and a, quite awful feudal system for a long, long time. But then we shift to the Industrial Revolution. We had the Agricultural Revolution to start with, that leads into the Industrial Revolution. It's a funky time period. We talk about it like it's a moment where something happened. Actually, in grad school, I had a seminar on British history where it was all about, like, we spent time on how, like, did the Industrial Revolution even happen? And there's a lot of historical evidence that argues that it didn't happen when we say it happened, or it didn't really even happen at all, or there was still plenty of this taking place. Blah, 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 blah. It's a confusing, fuzzy place, but we more or less understand that there's a shift at some point, and it starts in England specifically, and then it spreads out to the rest of the world. It goes from England, the British Isles, down to the rest of Europe, and then it comes over to the US, and then it goes over to Japan, and then it's kind of everywhere, right? So it's that diffusion is taking place. So we know there's a moment in which we shift from this very feudal economic system to an industrialized system where we have mass production, okay? And we have a lot of machines taking place or being built to replace human hands. So there's this, not full-on automation, like we don't have robots as we think of it today, but, stuff that would require 5 people using their hands to do. You have a machine that replaces those 5 people with like one machine operator. Right? So it's a way to make production more efficient, but it actually also leads to mass production. So we start making more stuff, producing more things. The economy grows, and so while some people are, out of business in the old sense, it's the idea that the economy itself grows. There are more jobs now because more machines are built, and it just, it's growth. It's the idea that the economy just gets bigger and bigger, right? And we start to see wage labor, the idea that you go to work. You work for somebody, they pay you a wage, like an hourly wage or whatever. That's something new with the Industrial Revolution. And it also requires a lot of new energy sources. It radically transforms the world. Okay, we'll leave it at that. I don't have time to get into all of this stuff. It's an important moment, is the idea. We don't need to get into how steel is made. We don't. Look, let's just get into this. All right, we'll wrap this stuff up with these 4 industrial sectors. So this is after the Industrial Revolution. We start to see these clear sectors of government. And these are new, like the quaternary one. These have expanded since the Industrial Revolution started, whenever that actually was, and it continues to change, and it gets like all of this stuff. It's messy, and it's contextual, and it's ever changing. But these are the main concepts here. So primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. It's a fancy way of saying first, second, third, fourth. Right? So primary, this is the extraction of resources, of raw materials, of the stuff that will be used to make other stuff, right? We either turn it into, something totally new, or it's used to power the machines that make something new, or whatever. Okay? It's just pulling resources out of the ground, right, or wherever, out of the air, wherever you're getting these resources from. And we, of course, we have renewable resources, those that, as long as we're careful with them, we can have forever. Right? So it's the idea, like with lumber, timber. We can have trees theoretically forever that we can cut down, harvest for wood that we use to make stuff, build with, all that, right? And now, of course, if we you've read the Lorax, you know how it works. If we quickly cut all this stuff down, we can't replace the supplies in time, and so we run out. But as long as we're responsible, we're cool. And then non-renewable are those like fossil fuels, oil, gas, that kind of stuff, where no matter what, even if we're responsible, eventually we run out of this stuff, right? Because they're called fossil fuels, because it takes millions of years for organic plant and animal tissue remains to transform into the petroleum products that we love so much today. So if we use up what exists, we can't sit around for 60 million years and wait for this stuff to come back. So no matter what, once we run out of oil, run out of natural gas, it's done. Right? That's the idea. This image is showing folks extracting diamonds out of the ground. I always like to do that. This is a great thing when I started my geography education. It makes it so you never have to buy jewelry for anyone ever again. I always bring this up with my wife because you just see it's like that primary industry of pulling up mining of precious gemstones and all that. Quite often, it's not the greatest human rights thing. So you just say that, when Valentine's Day, your anniversary or whatever is coming along. So I'd love to buy you this very expensive diamond necklace, but think of the people. And it's great. And then you buy a Olive Garden gift card or whatever, and you're good, right? Because that's more responsible. So there you go. So primary sector is simply making stuff. Now there's this term, and Steve Graves in your chapter on this stuff, he gets into it. It's called the leakage effect. It makes me giggle. It sounds like like I had a dog years ago where he had this leakage effect, where it was something like we neutered him too young, or we didn't even neuter him because he showed up at our house. But he was neutered too young. That's what the vet thought. And so there were times when he'd like lie down on the floor and he'd just leak pee. He'd just have a little puddle. And so we took him to the vet. Like, what's going on? They thought it was the neutering, and so they prescribed testosterone for the dog so that he wouldn't have the leakage effect. That's what I think of. So that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about a dribbling dog. It's referring to the idea, and I've already discussed this like with plantation agriculture, but it's the idea that with this primary sector, you have resources being extracted, but quite often the people who are in charge, the capitalists, the people who are investing in extracting these resources, they don't live right there in that area. Okay? Maybe they did early on with some of this stuff, but today, with globalization, it goes back it's like our bananas, right? We got our Del Monte, which looks Latin as hell, but it's not. As I said, it's a San Francisco transnational corporation, but it looks like, hey, Latin America, fantastic. I'll buy my bananas to help you guys out. But the profits, as well as the resources themselves, are leaking out of Ecuador, wherever they're being harvested, and coming up here to California. Right? So, and we can see this everywhere in all sectors, but it's really pronounced in the primary sector, in this extraction of natural resources. And this gets into the idea of why certain countries are poor, other ones are wealthy. It's looking at the economics and where the resources themselves are going, where capital is going, and therefore profits are going, and all of that. Right? So that's what this leakage effect is referring to. Not to my leaking dog. The secondary sector. This is the manufacturing sector, where we take those raw materials and we turn them into something else. Or maybe we also take like steel, is where we're taking iron ore, we're turning it into steel, and then that steel can continue to be manufactured into an automobile, right? Or an appliance of some kind or whatever. And so that's the general idea. People who are making things, manufacturing goods, they exist within the secondary sector. And as I have on the slide here, it used to be very clear regions of where stuff was manufactured and where it wasn't, and it just made sense. You connected your manufacturing plants to where the raw materials were. So like we had a lot of manufacturing taking place in the Midwest, the northern Midwest of the U.S. Because we had iron ore and coal and stuff like that that was found there. So it was easy to take that stuff, turn it into steel, and then turn it into cars because it was all right there. It didn't make economic sense to ship stuff all over the world, right? Now with transportation, some stuff we'll get into with these other sectors, it's okay, and it can make sense for other reasons and all that. So we don't see it as much. It's not like all American cars are produced in Michigan. End of story. It's spread out. It's kind of weird where different things are being made, and that again gets into globalization and stuff that we'll be talking about. Another issue with this, and we've talked about this a little bit because we watched Roger and me and we covered this stuff, but with manufacturing throughout the 20th century, there's a real push to streamline the assembly line and the actual manufacturing of stuff. And we credit Henry Ford with this. We actually got a guy named Taylor who did all these scientific studies on just eliminating waste in terms of human movement and so on. So in trying to make humans, effectively robots, as efficient as possible to not have any wasted effort, you can ensure that more stuff gets made in a workday and therefore increase profits and the whole idea. So manufacturing jobs are actually, they're so streamlined that they're low skilled jobs, in that you're not like, if you make a car like with this image right here, like the guy that's in the car right there, I don't know exactly what he's working on, but let's say he's in charge of part of the cooling system, like maybe not even putting the radiator itself in, but some stuff that will help mount the radiator. So he has this one task. All right, he's not an engineer in that he can't fully design a whole car. He's not even a mechanic, doesn't necessarily know how to fix a car or even work on the cooling system or whatever. What he's been trained to do is put in like 4 bolts into the car and then send this down the way. Right? That's the idea, and that's a very efficient thing because you can get really good. Like if you've ever worked on a car, if you've never done it, like I've done stuff where it's like I haven't done it, watch a YouTube video, have a general idea of what should go on, but it takes me like 8 hours to do something that would take a trained person 30 minutes to do because I'm figuring it out as I go, right? The streamlining idea is have this person do one repetitive task over and over and over and over. They're going to get really fast at it, get really good at it, and again, we're going to manufacture a lot of cars or whatever. And that was a big problem when you had factories in Flint closing. The auto workers, they didn't really have skills that they could transfer elsewhere. If there wasn't another automobile manufacturing plant that needed somebody who could, screw in 4 bolts or whatever, well, then they're out of luck, right? And that's why it's so hard for a lot of, what we think of as blue-collar workers to go on and get another job. They've been trained to not have transferable skills. They've been trained to do one thing over and over and over. If that suddenly vanishes, they're in trouble. And that's exactly what we saw. And that's this whole idea of deindustrialization is where we've seen in places like in this country, we had a very big booming secondary sector industry at work. Like cars are a good example, but steel mills and other stuff like that. So we talk about with our economy, or coal mines and all of that. A lot of that's gone because it's gone elsewhere, and the secondary sector has been replaced by the tertiary and quaternary here in this country. All right, but that's great for people who have gone on to college, have studied the stuff to thrive in some of these other sectors. But if you were that blue collar assembly line worker, you're out of luck, right? There are fewer and fewer jobs that you are trained for. And so what are your options? You gotta find something else or go get some kind of training or whatever. But like many of you, who are listening to me now who aren't independently wealthy and all that, you realize, yeah, that's easier said than done. All right, just like all those great wealthy folks in Roger and me who kept saying, get up and do something. Very difficult to do. So that's the issue with the secondary sector. Here are these, clear regions. We don't need to dwell on that. Today, like the secondary sector still exists. It just doesn't really exist that much here in this country. I mean, it does. We have manufacturing. I was just talking about, people are manufacturing buses and train cars and all that here in the Antelope Valley, but it's not what it once was. It's not this major employer of Americans, and that's because the companies that still are involved with manufacturing, they're what we call transnational corporations. So these are companies that are headquartered in one nation, but they operate in multiple. So you have your headquarters like here in California, but you have all the manufacturing stuff happening quite often in 3 or 4 different nations, and or one part of your final product will be made in this country, and then the other part will be made in this country, and then it'll be assembled in a totally different country, and then these things will be sold in even other countries. Quite often we see the goods that are manufactured in one country aren't actually legally able to be sold because of trade agreements in that country. So they go to other places, which is fascinating. You can't even buy what you make. And quite often you couldn't anyway because you don't make enough money to buy the stuff, whatever it might be. So there's still some manufacturing going on here, but our big, companies that are producing goods, they might be headquartered here, they might be American companies, but they're making stuff elsewhere. And that's where it gets complicated too. The whole idea of buy American, we don't hear it as much anymore. Like it was really big in the 80s and the 90s. Today we don't say it that much because it's a meaningless term. Right? What does it mean to buy American? We can use cars as an example of this stuff. We think of Ford, General Motors, Dodge. These are American companies. So like if I'm a patriot, I'm gonna go buy a Ford automobile or a Chevy or whatever. But if I'm doing that, I'm supporting an American transnational corporation in the sense that I'm helping the CEOs of Ford, the good American, CEOs that exist. But I'm not necessarily helping American workers because most of that stuff is manufactured in some other place. So if I'm helping like working class folks, and helping is a questionable thing, but I'm helping Mexicans or Brazilians or, somebody else other than American workers. But, and this is where it gets really wacky, if I buy a Toyota, I'm supporting a Japanese company, but there's a good chance that what I'm buying was actually made here in this country. So maybe I'm helping out wealthy folks in another country, but I'm helping American auto workers with that Japanese car. It gets complex. And even the car itself, like some components are made here and others are made in other countries and so on. It's impossible to truly support, a fully American company these days. And we get stuff like this. Like this I had to buy a screwdriver. I needed like an extra set of screwdrivers for like, I don't know, some toolkit or whatever. And so how can you not buy this, right? Huge on the package. It says made in USA. And so I salute it and I go to buy it. But then if you look carefully, and I blew this up here, but it says made in the USA with global materials. These are screwdrivers. These aren't like complex machines with different intricate parts. Flipping screwdrivers, right? So it's the idea that like the stuff, I just kind of picture like it's Chinese plastic and it actually probably like Chinese steel and Indian plastic that's been brought over and an American worker just sticks it together and we can say made in the USA, even though again it's meaningless, right? So a lot of the secondary stuff, it's a very questionable, weird thing. And a lot of this, too, like I said, it's the transnational corporations where these things are headquartered. They're centering around what we call technopoles, which are individual locations, these concentrations of what are getting to be more and more high tech manufacturers. Silicon Valley is a great example of this. Like, nobody's actually making computers or hardware stuff around San Jose. But all of the high tech like decisions are being made, the engineering stuff like that is taking place, and we'll talk about this at more length when we get into globalization. But it's the idea that place is really important, and if you're trying to be successful in the current global economy, where you live is a very important thing. Okay, so we'll cover that more. Um, but a lot of this too, like as we've gotten rid of manufacturing, we've shifted a lot of our focus onto this next sector, what we call the tertiary sector, which just means third. And this is something where it's quite often, like it's argued to be, we're in a post-industrial era, and we had, like this. I just grabbed this image of like future city off of Google, because that's what we tend to envision. We're no longer, making things and having just like dirty cities and industrial stuff. Everything's cleaner and happier, and it's going to be better. That's yes, we're not that whole resource extraction and manufacturing. Oh, that's the past. That's when we were savages. Now, we're modern. We're post-industrial, and we don't question what that means. We kind of just figure like, yeah, nobody takes stuff out of the earth and process it in a way that pollutes anymore, stuff like that. I mean, just look at how clean everything is. I remember hearing, like during the Democratic primary, somebody was talking about how clean. I think it was Kamala Harris. Just like what we've done would make sense because you're talking about California, and like LA and how filthy LA used to be in terms of air quality and all that. And we've worked so hard to clean it up. And now the air, it's still got its issues, but it's not what it once was because of strong government policies and all that. But it plays into this idea of this post industrial era that we feel like, yeah, we're just getting cleaner as a society. What we don't realize is that we've just moved all of the dirty primary and secondary industries to other, quite often poorer countries. In fact, I was at a conference a few years ago. I was on the metro in Boston, just chatting it up with this Chinese geographer. Oh, we had a great time. We were just talking. We solved the world's problems on the way, from downtown Boston over to Cambridge. We saved all the problems of the world. We saved the world. But he was talking about, we were talking about like Beijing air quality and how polluted it is, and he was saying, and I was agreeing with that. It's a case of like everybody points to China as being this filthy, gross country, and we see this in India too. But it's simply because places like the United States and Western Europe, we took all those filthy jobs and we shipped them overseas. So we seem clean, we seem futuristic and advanced. We still rely on all this stuff. We've just moved it out of our neighborhood, right? And we've let other people, suffer from lung damage and all that. And we pat ourselves on the back and like, see, we're so green and clean, but we keep importing all sorts of stuff and propagating all of this pollution, right? So don't fall into that trap that the tertiary sector is a, clean thing and it's the future and everything's fine. And like we're seeing that with, the economy looks miserable during this whole COVID-19 thing. There's been a lot of talk of like high tech stuff where, Zoom is the way of the future. We're going to have all these teleconferences and you look at the earth and how clean it is, like nobody's using oil. So that's great. And we've got fish swimming in Venice, Italy canals again, and the sky's cleaner and animals are retaking places as humans go. And we like to say like, see, everything's better now. But what we don't see is the pollution that comes from manufacturing the computers or the phones or whatever that allow Zoom to take place, right? And some of this other stuff. So don't fall into this trap that primary and secondary, it's what savages do, it's our past, and anybody else who does it, they just haven't caught up to us. No, we still rely on it. We just have other people do our dirty work. But that said, we have to be realistic about this. A lot of you guys, going to college, listening to this, you're not in college so that you can, overtake the system and have like that communist ideal or whatever, and live in a land of harmony where butterflies land on your shoulder and everybody's cool and we have hemp clothes or whatever. I mean, maybe one or two of you feel that way. But for most of us, we're just like, we're in college, we need a job, right? And we know we're going to have a crappy job if we don't go to college. And if we go to college, we're going to have a good job, right? College is going to be the difference between do I have a nice car or no car, right? We're not even worried about what cars mean and how they're destroying the earth and all that stuff. It's just like, look, what can I do? I'm one person. And I get it. And I've been there. I'm still there. I like, that was bullshit right there. I'm kind of like, hey, man, I get it. Making it sound like I'm fighting the system and all that. No, I'm talking into a computer and saying, oh, the system sucks, man. And then I'll be done and I'll go into my polluting house and do all my polluting consumption and all of that, right? Like I'm just as part of the system. I just get to use big words to make it sound like I'm detached. Now we're all in this thing. So yes, everything sucks, but we're in that everything. So what you want to be thinking, my college students, is also like, what does this mean for me? What we've seen is that working in the primary and secondary sectors, not really lucrative unless you're high up in management, right? So for most people, the primary and secondary sectors, we don't want to waste our time. That's why you're in college. It's really to get a job in the tertiary or the quaternary sector. Okay? We quite often, the tertiary sector is called the service sector, which kind of makes it sound like you're working retail or you work at Starbucks or whatever, like you're serving customers, but it's much more than just that. I mean, that can be part of it, but really in general, you're just dealing with the goods, the stuff that is produced within that primary and secondary sector, and you're helping to facilitate more production. Okay? So it's through things like transportation, and then we have what we call producer and consumer services. Now, transportation is where we have, the movement of goods, of things. Some of that is directly government related. Again, gets into this whole idea of a free market and how that's something of a myth. Our interstate system here in the United States, we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into urban and suburban geography, but that's to help facilitate the production, right? And it was started, a lot of that was defense. It was formed after World War II. It's Eisenhower trying to get like the German Autobahn system here, so if there is a World War III, we can quickly move our military from one coast to another, right? That's the initial kind of push for it, was a way to make sure we're secure as we're coming fresh off of World War II, but it's a way to ensure that companies can continue to move goods. We invest in this stuff, right? And it's a form of capital in the sense that the interstate, our whole highway system in this country, is a way to ensure that goods flow and more money is made and all of that. And it's not, I mean, you can think like truck driver or whatever, UPS driver like we see here. And that's an important role. But a company like UPS, they're not simply driving, getting a package, putting it in a truck, and driving somewhere else. Like, it is very complex, and just logistics in general. This is something that is going to continue to grow, especially in light of, with this pandemic and the way people are stuck at home, stores are closed, but you can still order stuff online and have it delivered to you. It's not as simple as just, I put in an order for whatever at a place like Amazon, and somebody walks to the shelf and pulls that off and puts it in a truck, and it comes my way. There's more going on with all this stuff. And we'll get into this whole idea of outsourcing as well, which is often, it's not exactly what we think of it as. So I'll talk about that when we get into globalization. But the tertiary sectors, where a lot of this outsourcing is taking place. And it doesn't mean, to kind of get to what I'm going to be talking about, it doesn't mean that outsourcing is you take jobs and put them in India or China or Mexico or whatever. Outsourcing is one company taking a job they don't want to do anymore and hiring another company to do it. Okay? And so we'll get into some of how that works. But a lot of that is dealing with these tertiary sector jobs. Okay? Producer services are you're helping out the people who are producing goods. Okay? So you're helping the secondary service or sector or the primary sector, whether they're producing, the extracted raw materials or manufactured goods. It's anybody who's helping to facilitate, again, that production. Insurance agencies, banks, advertising, marketing companies, right? Getting people to want to buy the stuff, real estate stuff. So we're helping to facilitate certain things, but you're not directly involved with the production of those goods, right? But you're helping it, if that makes sense. And one thing with this, we're seeing, like it was thought that like the tertiary stuff, that's good. Like manufacturing, primary, secondary stuff, that's all going to be overseas, but tertiary, we're safe. Actually, what we're seeing is that tertiary stuff is all going overseas, so what we call offshoring. All right, so outsourcing is just taking one job, giving it to another company. Offshoring is where that process of outsourcing goes from one country to another. And we see this in a lot of different stuff. We'll talk about this more at length, but you'll have the company still headquartered in the wealthier nations, but the more low skill, even in some cases high skilled stuff, is going to the global south, going to wherever. And so this is why, like, just getting a college degree in general can be a worthless thing, or even a bad thing, in that you're stuck with all this debt and you got nothing to show for it. You can't get a job because what you studied, what you learned to do, it's all overseas. Like you got to move to India to be able to do anything there, right? So that's an issue. And again, with globalization, we'll talk about this more. And then consumer services. This is, helping people spend their money effectively. And one, we don't need to get into all of this, but one thing that is big business around the world is tourism. And we don't often think of it as a way to export something, but it is a case where people, in one country, they've got some kind of, natural resources, ecosystems that other people don't have. So you export it to people by encouraging those people to fly to your country to see it, to take the pictures. They have this great experience, and then they fly back home and they say like, "Oh yes, I've been to India. I've done India." That's always good when you say I've done Western Europe, and you flew over, you took some pictures of some cathedrals, and you feel like you've seen the world. But this is a big thing. Tourism is a huge deal, and it gets back to that diversifying national industries. A lot of countries around the world are suffering now because they're so heavily invested in tourism, in having people bring their money to the country, spending it there to take pictures of tigers and stuff like that. And we know you don't even have to go to India or wherever to take pictures of tigers. You go to, what was it, Oklahoma? You seen the Tiger King? Oh, I couldn't get enough. That's a good way to feel like humanity is doing fine, right? But yeah, even that, like flying into Oklahoma, I don't know if it's still open. It might not be. It didn't end so well. Spoiler alert. But like going to Oklahoma, like the reason why that crazy Tiger King place still existed was, it's tourism dollars, right? That's a good thing, a good consumer service. So it's a really big part of this industry. It's an awful picture because the lighting wasn't that great, and I'm not a great photographer. But this is a hotel in Havana. Fanciest hotel I think I've ever been in. Gorgeous, just incredible. In this, this commie nation. But the Cubans are no fools. They understand tourism, and it's not a lot of American tourists coming in, but it's Germans and Brits and Canadians and people who aren't at war with the country come in here and spend a ridiculous amount of money. That's a way in which this, communist regime, who's got no help from the rest of the world since the Soviet Union fell, this is how they've been able to stay afloat. It's through tourism. So you can see too this idea of communism versus capitalism. It's a false division. Quite often, this stuff is intertwined and it's working together, and so we shouldn't just use these labels, these simple labels. We should instead think carefully about what we're saying and study this stuff. All right, now finally, got the quaternary sector, fourth sector, if we want to talk like humans. This is where we've got knowledge, information, high skill stuff, data, big data. That's a made up thing we like to talk about today. That's the latest hip thing. But it's just dealing, it's information. That's the best way to think about it. IT stuff, as well as media. This is, of course, huge with COVID-19 and people stuck in their homes. And you see if you reading the news, looking at this stuff, certain sectors, obviously, like some of this tertiary stuff, they're suffering. But the quaternary sector, the Netflixes and the Zooms and the, Apple and social media companies and all that, they're doing quite well. It's all anybody can mess with, right? So that's, we'll see what happens, years after COVID-19. We'll see what, comes of it. But clearly the quaternary sector is this area of incredible growth. And we're deeming as a society that this is the really important sector. And I do like technically education goes into this, where it makes it sound like, teachers are, also part of the hip cutting edge, like the wealthy folks. No, it's totally different. Like financial planning. God, we'll talk about that. If you want to make money in the quaternary sector, go into something like financial planning. If you, just don't want to do anything else, then you go into education, right? That's why we're here. And we don't really fit with some of these other groups here. But so this is looking at information. That's seen as the really valuable thing in, again, in quotes, post-industrial societies. Right? And so that's where a lot of this growth is. This is just something to think about for those of you who are figuring out your majors, trying to decide what it is you're going to do. This is where growth is taking place. But again, we'll talk about, more of this stuff. One key thing, like it's one thing to say, like, yeah, I'm going to be, computer science. That's what I'm going to major in. But you have to do it right. And we've seen, once again, like with all this stuff, place matters. Where you live matters, because that's where you'll be able to find work and good work in this stuff that won't necessarily be shipped offshore. Although, as we'll continue to talk about, nobody is safe at all. But we have a clear core periphery model at work. So like with IT stuff, like this image here, we're looking at Stanford. That's the core. That's where innovation is taking place. This is where wealth is made and held and all of that. Research universities, and just a few real major ones, are where innovation is taking place and wealth is being accrued. And then everybody else is on the periphery. And that's, you could major in computer science. You could have a decent living in a place like the Antelope Valley, make enough money to, have a place to live and be comfortable throughout your life. But the real, this idea of really making it, of, leading an industry and advancing your career and being successful in that way in which we tell ourselves we want to be, you got to be connected to a specific place. Okay. And that's, and that's not to say that, like, and if you don't do that, if you don't, work for a big tech company near Stanford, you're a failure. It's just like, that's where the wealth is, right? So this idea of just, go to college and you'll make tons of money and you'll be great. Like, we need to question the spatial nature of that stuff. So that's another thing to think about, my community college students who will be thinking about transferring to places. Like, as you're doing it, yeah, of course, look for the fun city where you want to live. Like, I love the beach. I want to be here. I want to be in this big city or whatever. Do that, but also think about what do I want to work in, right? And go to that university that's in that area, in that core area, the field you're interested in. Life's going to be a lot easier, right? And then if you go far away from that stuff. So just think about the spatial nature of these things. And then to wrap it up, I always like to wrap up a lecture with a story of hope. So this is a great graph right here showing just income distribution for, like this ends in 2007. So a little dated now. But going back decades, we're looking at the US economy, okay, in terms of income. And so it's broken down in percentile. So getting a sense of basically the 20th percentile, this is the lowest, group in terms of income in America. And the 95th percentile, these are the super wealthy people, right? And so like around the 60th to 80th, this is middle class, if you want to think of it that way. All right, so as we're going along, like you see down here with 1950, hold on, let me make it official with a laser pointer. So in the 1950s, so post-war, right, post-World War II stuff, it's broken down. You've got these clear economic classes in place, and it's seen as like, okay, if we look at this as the starting point, where you have wealthy people, you have poor people, but it's in this kind of even distribution here. That's seen as from if you're going to have a capitalist society, if you're not going for full communist utopia, this is seen as fair and just. And then as we move forward into the years, what you see is that, well, the poorest folks, they made slight improvements. They're kind of, hanging steady down there at the bottom. And you go up to the next one, a little bit of growth, over the years. Every year gets a little bit better. And as you keep going up, even, the upper middle class, they're doing better. But you see the super wealthy, they've been making more and more money. What this gap represents here is a larger gap between the wealthy and the poor and even the middle class, right? So it's the idea that, whatever economic system we have going, wherever, different economic sectors have been in place and we're shipping off other places and doing this and doing that, what we've seen for, the last half of the 20th century, and this is continuing into the 21st century, is that this difference between the wealthy and poor, it's increased. Okay? It's gotten bigger. And there are different ways in which you can interpret it. You can say, yeah, but the wealthy, they're creating jobs, they're working hard, and look at brilliant people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and these different inventors and all that. Like, yeah, of course they're super well. They've earned it, and that you can be okay with it that way. Or you can just say, look, it's capitalism. That's how it works, and like I'm okay with it because I'm going to college. I got a plan, and I'm going to be the next Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, whoever is the latest, hip tech person. I'm going to be that person, so it's okay, right? And so we're fine with that stuff. Or you can look at it and say, this is bullshit, which is, what more people seem to be doing these days. Maybe it's just the people I talk to. But it's the idea, like, yeah, it's one thing to have wealth inequality here. We get it. Some people do, in fact, work harder than other people or really, hustling to try to make some money. But this gap, this is exploded. That's not fair. But here's the deal. Honestly, however you look at it, whether you think this is awful, whether you think it's totally fine, what you got to be honest about, my college students who are listening to this, is that if you want to be comfortable, even if you want to get to that point where in this country you can have money coming in and have savings and go on vacations and just not have to constantly worry, you got to get up here, right? And to get up here, you've got to, look into like this quaternary sector or the tertiary sector and look at how this stuff works, and just be honest with yourself as you're going through college to make sure that when you're done with college, you're able to be successful. So in the absence of total revolution, which I get, but we're also very comfortable people, and it's questionable whether that's going to happen in the foreseeable future. Fight for justice for people, but also think about yourselves, right? And the fact that you are stuck in this system, what does that mean for you, right? There's my pep talk. I'm not here to say like, so therefore, my proletariat, we've got to overthrow the industrialist pigs. I'm not saying that. And I'm also not saying that capitalism's great. Nothing's wrong with it. Free market is the coolest. No, but I am saying, like, these are the extremes. Both of them, the communist utopia, the free market utopia, they've never fully existed. Or when we've seen glimpses of them, they haven't worked out. Just say it that way. So you've got these extremes. Everything else is overlapped and fuzzy. And we just need to think about, okay, I'm part of the system. The system's bigger than any one individual. I can't myself just say, like, you know what, this sucks. Like, I don't think that me talking about this stuff is going to get you guys like going like, yeah, he's right. And it's like the racism thing we talked about, right? Me just saying it to you and you telling two friends and whatever, that's not actually going to enact change in, in a positive way or a negative way. So that's not what is happening here. Instead, what we need to do is just we need to be aware of what's going on and then think about our own ethical role in all of this. What are we okay with, right? What am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? What makes me stay up at night? What can I have a good night's sleep on? That kind of stuff. We want to be aware of the system, see what we can deal with, and then also work to change that stuff that we're not okay with, right? So either fight the man or become the man, because it looks like it's a really good, place to be. All right? All right, I'll talk to you later, geographers. Have a lovely, lovely day.